Hi, and welcome to Formation, a weekly conversations for followers of Jesus. I am Kara Watts, and I am here with
Renee Hauk.
Shannon Moore.
And we are in a series where we're talking actually about formation and what that looks like, and how do we become active in forming and working on our faith and our spiritual lives and that journey that we're on. And so we are talking about prayer. And last time we talked kind of about this just generalized, simplistic ideas about prayer. And today we're going to talk about actually formation prayers. And so that seemed appropriate and fitting for formation to talk about the formation prayer. But that's really that type of prayer that we start to think from, how does this habit and this process that we engage in that we call prayer, how does it really change us? What does that look like? And all the parts that go into it becoming something that we do into something that we can actually see is working in our lives and also in the world. So do you all, what do you think?
Well, and our guide for this conversation is this great book called Prayer by Richard Foster.
Yeah.
Just thought I'd give him a little shout out.
Yes, well, and it's full of all sorts of amazing, just small chapters that help us understand. Yes, very simple, about 10 pages or less for each chapter, that really lay out what it looks like for different types of prayer. And when you put them all together, it just really is such a profound way of looking at who we are and what prayer looks like.
I think when I read this information about what formation prayer is composed of, it's such a good practical description of something that I guess I must have learned over the years as my faith was taking shape and I was being influenced when I was younger by the prayers of other people. And I do remember multiple times when, as an adult, sitting most likely in a Bible study group, you had someone else say, God is really working on me this last week about such and such. And when people are willing to share in that way about their own experience of God in prayer, then you just get the sense that we're all under construction.
Right.
And we have a kind of a growing edge over here, or there's something that we're not really dealing with, and God is kind of calling us. When we can be honest about how God is speaking to us through prayer, it's really encouraging to other people to think we're all in a state of progress.
Yeah, we're all being,
or lack thereof.
We're all being formed in these ways. I always think about you when I think about prayer often, because you will in just casual conversation say things like, I've been praying about this, so I appreciate that as part of my formation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I loved how he started this chapter. He has in quotes, people say prayer changes things. And I used to serve at a church that was the name of the prayer list in the bulletin each week. Prayer changes things, and then the prayer list. And there were pencils that said, prayer changes things. But then he follows it up by saying it also changes us. And I think that's important, going back to what you were saying too, because if we approach prayer with, I'm going to say this prayer, and therefore God's going to change things or change something, that puts us in a position of power, in a way of, because I've said this prayer, because I have this discipline, God's going to do what I want God to do. But there's the other side of it, that we are affected, we are transformed, changed by prayer as well.
I think that I've told you both a story about the woman who was the prayer journal keeper. And anytime she was part of your circle for Bible study or whatever, you could count on her to remember what we prayed about last week, to remind us who we're praying for, and did we ever hear about this person. And then after many, many years, one day she decided she was just telling God what to do. And that wasn't her being available to God. It was the opposite of that. Right. It was, God's marching orders, and then her just waiting for God to take care of that so she could give God another assignment. And so, yes, how are we humble enough to submit ourselves to the kind of change that God seeks in our lives?
But I think it's also important to note that the prayer work she did for all those years was
legitimate,
valuable and legitimate. Right. But over the years, the Spirit
was moving in her life, and she needed She was being redirected.
Right. And so for some people, they may keep a prayer journal for
Right.
their entire
You're right.
lives. For her, it turned into something else because God was at work in her life in a different way than in somebody else's. I just love how we all, the scripture talks about the different gifts that we have and how each one of us is called to use those gifts. And I think it's the same way with prayer. How I pray might be completely different from how you pray or how that, however all of that works.
And there are seasons, don't you think? I think of Ecclesiastes, seasons in our prayer life. And she clearly was moving into a new season where the journal wasn't how God was going to speak to her. So I think to be open, to notice. We talked last week about the desert times when it's just really hard to pray at all. Right. All of that is about how we are being formed in the image of God.
Right. And one thing that Foster says is that how do these prayers, how do our prayers, how do our collective prayers, how do they form us and how do they bring about those fruits of the Spirit that grow and that spiritual growth that happens? And then he says, but be careful, because prayer is not enough, which I think is interesting as you're thinking about formation and how do we form ourselves as Christians and growing and on this journey of sorts along the way. And he says very clearly that part of developing holy habits, that prayer is not the only thing you need. And so I think that's also an important thing to remember, that there's kind of this golden triangle of classical disciplines, from solitude and fasting to worship and celebration, to these continual interactions where we are paying attention to the way the Spirit is moving in the world. And then this, what he names the patient endurance of God. So just that helps to develop us by means of the trials and the hard times, the frustrations that we encounter.
And we have a hard time seeing that as a creative period.
We see that being a very difficult time. So never isolating. He really cautions us to never just isolate prayer as being the thing that, if you pray every day and have a perfect, prayer life.
Perfect.
Yes, that's not enough. That formation takes so much more than just that.
That just made me think so much about, all I could think about was that food pyramid or the plate the image that you would see at school about a healthy
the vegetables,
diet and how many vegetables you need, grains and dairy and different things. And all of that was good for you, but too much of any of it isn't good for you or even healthy. But it also, it doesn't, those things never said you could never have ice cream, but in moderation, those different things. And that's what it made me think about. And in the long haul of a healthy diet in that way, you're going to see change and health and that sort of thing, but in the doing of it, it might seem mundane sometimes, or it might not seem the most exciting thing to do. But looking at it over the course of a lifetime, and I that was just the image that came to me as he was talking about that.
That makes a lot of sense. One of the things that Foster also reminds us of is that this formation type prayer, it's not just one thing. It is both active prayer and it's passive prayer. And so when we think about active prayer, we think about pursuing God. That's kind of we're on this journey of faith and we're looking for God along the way. And Renee, I think you have Philippians 3, verses 12 through 14, which reminds us a little bit of that, if you'll read that.
Pressing toward the goal, not that I have already obtained this or have already reached the goal, but I press on to make it my own, because Christ Jesus has made me his own. Beloved, I do not consider that I have made it my own, but this one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal of the prize of the heavenly call of God in Christ Jesus. Is that it? 14 or 15?
14.
Will you go back and read that last bit again about something behind and then straining forward? What was that again?
This one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal of the prize. So forgetting what lies, do you think that's to just forget about the past?
I think in some ways it reminds me of, not putting your hand on the plow and looking back.
Right.
But there's also something to be said for a healthy, back to that
Right.
metaphor, respect for and honoring of what got you where you are now.
Right. Well, that's
so-
true. But if you think of pressing on, if you're running and your focus is that finish line, doesn't I guess I sort of thought of Paul as riding towards the end of his life and thinking, at this point, if I'm going to make it to the finish line, all my energy has to go
Right.
toward that
That
prize.
thing.
And you mentioned seasons earlier, and so depending on what's happening in your life, if you're in that race, you don't have time to think about, I
about
should have gone a little faster around that last curve. You just got to keep thinking about what's.
I wonder if I turned off the iron. Don't be distracted. Yes. So this
Yeah.
seems very singular,
Right.
but all of those experiences have shaped and continue to shape
Right. And that and
who God is calling us
right.
to
And
be.
that active part of us of whatever in that moment.
Seeking.
Yeah. What
Striving
does that look
for.
like? But we are active in searching and praying in those ways. And then we also have the passive side where we are pursued by God, which I personally think that's harder for me. It's easier for me to think of an active prayer life than being pursued by God.
It gives us a little power
Yes.
in some ways.
Yeah. And if Shannon, if you'll read
I'm just going to read a
part-
little bit
yeah,
of
from Jeremiah
this. This is
18.
from the 18th chapter of Jeremiah, and it says, the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, go down to the potter's house, and there I will give you my message. So I went down to the potter's house, and I saw him working at the wheel. But the pot he was shaping from the clay was marred in his hands. So the potter formed it into another pot, shaping it as it seemed best to him. Then the word of the Lord came to me. He said, can I not do with you, Israel, as this potter does? Like clay in the hand of the potter, so you are in my hand, Israel. And that's what a beautiful image this is.
I love that passage.
And again, to be putty in the hand of the potter, that's hard.
It is, and I think we have to kind of, at least for me, I have to stop and remind myself that that's really what this is about. I mean, yes, I need to be pursuing, but I also need to just stop and recognize that God is working, and what does that look like in my life, and how does that, then how can I see that amongst all that I experience?
And if the clay is brittle and not pliable, it won't.
Right.
The potter can't turn it into something
Yes.
else.
It's we recently used some good clay in children's ministries, and the frustration of
It wasn't soft.
it wasn't
like
ready.
Play-Doh.
It wasn't ready, and so to just have to work that clay until it was ready to do what we wanted to do with it.
That's a good reminder, isn't
Yeah,
it?
and eventually everybody finally just kind of sat down and just started, and it
Working
was,
it.
right. And when that happens, it's interesting because you go from like a lot of excitement to everybody just kind of gets quiet and sits and plays. And there's a sense of calm, I think, when we put ourselves in that place. And I see it in real time when I watch children do that. I often have Play-Doh at my desk, but there's just something about that kneading and movement that when I imagine that that's what's happening in our lives, it's really powerful.
Do you think when we're being formed in that example from Jeremiah, we're probably not mindful until after and we look back most of the time, right? In the course of being formed, it's probably not our favorite time.
No, and it's
Or it may not feel
Probably-
like anything's happening from our perspective at the time. And then we see later,
or maybe it's
I was learning
uncomfortable, or who knows? But I think you're right. When suddenly you look and you're a new pot. How did that happen?
Well, one of the things that Foster does in this chapter is he gives us some examples of good formation type prayers, and there are some that you could look into. Ignatius of Loyola has some kind of exercises, 4 major exercises that take him through that. St. Benedict has a 12 steps uses the metaphor of Jacob's ladder, climbing Jacob's ladder, and these are very specific ways to be active. My favorite, and it's one that I don't know that I really recognized had a name, but The Little Way by Teresa.
Oh,
of
yes.
When I read that, I thought, I bet Kara talks about
and
this.
she
I
is
like
known
this
as
too.
the little flower, and it's just this deceptively simple way of seeking out the hard things and doing them, doing the menial tasks,
Ordinary.
doing what seems unimportant but is helpful, taking on the criticism, this is hard for me, being a friend to the annoying person, helping the ungrateful, all the things that always are just kind of when I hit the wall with my, those moments of just saying, okay, I can do this. And to recognize that as a form of prayer is really transformative for me.
Which theologian was it who lived in the house with the adults that had?
Henry Nouwen.
Okay, I thought it was
Yeah.
Henry Nouwen, and somebody came to interview him, and he asked where Henry Nouwen was, and he was in the bathroom, cleaning the bathrooms.
Yeah.
Just very ordinary that says, I'm available. Use
Right.
me.
Right.
And because when we choose how we want to serve, we don't choose the annoying people,
Right.
right? We
Right.
don't choose
It's
scrubbing
not
the
fun.
bathroom
That's
floor.
not fun.
So we elevate ourselves a little bit in the choices that we make. But
And this image of the pot and the it's not a fancy vase either that is just for decoration. These a pot you use is something useful, and that's I would think
that's right. That's a good point. It's not a piece of art.
right.
It's a very utilitarian.
And it may be beautiful. It may, be pleasing to the eye. It depends on the beholder, I guess. But if it's not useful,
Yeah. Why have that pot just sitting there? Yeah. There's something to me, and the beauty of that is also it's something that you can do at any age, and so even the youngest child is part of formation and forming, this spiritual journey that they're going to be going along on their own way.
didn't you see
Asking
an
them.
example of that just last week with the little one? And
Oh yes, when we did our sack lunch ministry, we had a family service Sunday, and the task was very simple. We had available for all ages, but from the very tiny, an barely 2-year-old who was able to go, and it took a while to figure out that the crackers and the Rice Krispie treats were not a snack. And that they were for someone else, and to just take that and to place it in that bag and then just keep doing that. And then, a 4-year-old and a 3rd grader that were just completely in it, 100%. Found the rhythm of just this simple task.
And there was some conversation about who would receive the
Right,
lunches, so they
absolutely.
knew
Yeah.
they were going to
And
make a
even later
difference.
that evening, we had, with our bridge program, our 4th through 6th graders, we had the opportunity to go in, finish making some sandwiches, and then have some time for prayer around those sacks and to really imagine
That's great.
what does it look like, when we're doing this. That service sometimes looks like we're really helping someone, and sometimes service looks like we're moving all the boxes and breaking them down because it's all of that, and that's the simple.
That's formation.
That's
that was
formation
going on
that's
on
happening.
Sunday.
Yeah, absolutely. And one last way that Foster talks about this formation and being open to this, quietness so that we can be formed is solitude. And that solitude, he says, we die not only to others, but also to ourselves. It helps us not to have energy for the road ahead, but to not care about the road ahead. So to sit, to be quiet, to let God do what God will do, and to listen for what that might be. Not so that we have energy to jump back in and do everything, but instead so we can jump back in and recognize what's really important. So that's important. That's hard for me. That's why solitude is tough.
So there's some in this chapter, this formation chapter, there's some eating your vegetables in there
There's
where spiritual formation is concerned, isn't there?
there's a lot of eating your vegetables, I think.
And,
yeah.
and choosing a different path and attending to what God is doing
yeah.
as you are on that path.
Right. Not just what do I need to do? What does that need to look like? But what do I need to pay attention to?
I
so
love
that
this
can do
because I'm not sure that anybody taught me all of this
Yeah.
as I was growing up.
Right.
So I love this. I would really commend this book to
excellent.
Yes.
anybody who would like
excellent.
to have a little more formation going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. Great conversation.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for being with us. If you have any comments or questions or more things that we should talk about or your experiences with prayer, we would love to hear from you at formation@uccftw.com. And
We got some mail this week.
we got some
I was
mail
very
this week.
excited.
Yes, it was wonderful. We always appreciate that. It helps us know that we're kind
Yes.
of that we're on the right track and that that we are moving in the right direction together as a community as we all continue to figure out what this journey looks like. So we look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.
Take care.